UK shock. Keir Starmer replaces Boris. You can't vote for another party except Labour government. Sir Keir Starmer has called for the Labour Party to follow former Prime Minister Tony Blair's legacy in his latest bid to win the next general election. Sir Keir has had a rocky start to his first year as Labour leader after taking over from Jeremy Corbyn following his dismal result in the 2019 election. Labour saw its worst result since 1935 after Boris Johnson seized many red wall seats in the north and won the vote by a huge majority of 80. Sir Keir has now acknowledged he has a battle on his hands to win back his party's popularity among the British public, particularly as Labour has lost 4 general elections in a row since 2010. He revealed his new strategy is for the party to recapture the glory years of when Tony Blair took the helm in the late 1990s. In 1997, he saw a historic Labour landslide with a majority of 179. Sir Keir said the party should be very proud of what it achieved under Mr. Blair, despite his controversies with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He added his one vision now is to win the next election, which is due in May 2022. Sir Keir's leadership has scrutinised by some members on the left of the party since he took over from Mr. Corbyn in April last year. He has come under fire for the party appearing to trying to diffuse disputes within Labour, rather than opposing the Conservatives. But Sir Keir added, "We have to turn the Labour Party inside out, and that's what we've been doing for the last 18 months. Too many of our members and supporters think winning an internal argument in the Labour Party is changing the world. It isn't. We've got to get real." Labour also suffered a setback when the Tories took the former Labour heartland of Hartlepool in a by-election in May. But there was a small glimmer of hope for the party after the victory of Kim Leadbeater in Batley and Spen, in Yorkshire, in July. Sir Keir said, "Under our current system, if you want a Labour government you have to vote Labour." However, Sir Keir may still have a long way to go after an Ipsos Mori survey for the Standard last month showed half of voters felt he was doing a bad job as leader. The poll showed 59% of voters thought he did a bad job at setting out a clear alternative to the government, with just 18% saying a good job. Kieran Pedley, Director of Politics for Ipsos Mori, said, "Labour's narrow victory in Batley and Spen could prove a political lifeline for Keir Starmer in the short term. However, his scores are still much lower than at the start of his leadership, and don't stand out as very good historically. He has plenty of work to do to genuinely turn things around, rather than just stop the rot." The Labour leader used an interview ahead of a visit to Scotland to bluntly reject any link-up with the Nationalists. The SNP is the third largest party at Westminster with 45 MPs, but they would almost certainly demand a new independence referendum as the cost of an alliance. Mr. Starmer used an interview to rule out what proponents have called a progressive alliance at the next election to try to unseat the Conservatives. He said, "The questions going into that election are going to be generational questions. How do we ensure that as we come out of the pandemic we deal with the fundamental weaknesses that lead us with the highest death toll and the biggest impact of any major economy? And secondly, how do we meet the climate emergency? They can only be answered, in my view, by a strong Labour government in Westminster. The central issue will be if you want a Labour government you have to vote Labour. You can't vote for another party and get a Labour government in Westminster. That will be our strategic approach to those elections, and there'll be no coalition going into those elections and no coalition coming out of it." Labour was once the major electoral power in Scotland, but it has constantly lost ground in the 21st century and currently holds just one seat after the disastrous 2019 election. Sir Keir admitted he would be prepared to talk to Ms Sturgeon, but only about issues like climate change. He argued the focus should be on the recovery from the coronavirus pandemic and climate change rather than Scottish independence, ahead of his 2-day visit to Scotland. He said he will happily sit down with the First Minister prior to November's climate change summit in Glasgow because leadership going into COP26 requires that kind of diplomacy.